اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان الرجیم بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم قل هو اللہ احد اللہ الصمد لم یلد ولم یولد ولم یکن له کفوا احد.
اعوذ باللہ من الشیطان اللعین الرجیم بسم اللہ الرحمن الرحیم ان اللہ وملائکتہ یصلون علی النبی یا ایہا الذین آمنوا صلوا علیہ وسلموا تسلیما. اے چاند کربلا کے تو نے تو دیکھے ہوں گے، اترے تھے اس زمیں پر عرش بری کے تارے. اے چاند کربلا کے تو نے تو دیکھے ہوں گے، اترے تھے اس زمیں پر عرش بری کے تارے. اے چاند جلوہ گر ہے ہاشم کا چاند یہاں پر، خیرات روشنی کی لے لیجیو یہاں سے. اے چاند کربلا کے، اے چاند اس زمین پر رکھیو ہمیشہ ٹھنڈک، سوتے جو ہیں یہاں پر زہرا کے ہیں یہ پیارے. اے چاند کربلا کے، تسنیم و سلسبیل و کوثر کے ہیں یہ مالک، مارے گئے جو پیاسے اس نہر کے کنارے. اے چاند کربلا کے، حر اور حبیب جیسے جانباز اور احبا مارے گئے یہیں پر انصار شاہدی کے. اے چاند مارے گئے یہیں پر بے دردی و ستم سے، مسلم کے دونوں پیارے زینب کے دونوں بیٹے. پامال ہو رہی تھی قاسم کی لاش رنگ میں، عباس اور سرور چنتے تھے ان کے ٹکڑے، بازو کٹے یہیں پر عباس با وفا کے، اذن بغا نہ پایا پانی بھلا نہ پائے، اے چاند کربلا کے، اس سرزمیں پہ گزرا سرور پہ یہ بھی صدمہ، سینے پہ کھائی برچھی ہم شکل مصطفیٰ نے، پانی پنانے لائے ایک لقا کو سرور، کیا ذبح حرملا نے، تیرے ستم لگا کے، گردن چھدی پسر کی، بازو چھدا پدر کا، دونوں تڑپ تڑپ کر پیاسے جہاں سے گزرے، اے چاند کربلا کے، اس بن میں ایک بچی بابا کو ڈھونڈتی تھی، بکھرے ہوئے پڑے تھے جب سر برید لاشیں، پھر یہ بھی تو نے دیکھا وہ غم رسیدہ بچی، سینے پہ سو رہی تھی بے سر پدر سے لپٹے، اے چاند کربلا کے، بازو بندھے یہیں پر پہل حرم کے، اس سرزمین سے نکلے سجاد سر جھکائے، اے چاند کربلا کے، شہزادہ جناحی مالک ہے کربلا کا، کس کی مجال آئے جب تک نہ وہ بلائے، پہنچا ہے کربلا میں ناچیز سبط جعفر، اے کاش پھر مقدر ہم کو یہ دن دکھائے، اے چاند کربلا کے، محمد و آل محمد صلوات۔
رحم الله من قرأ سورة الفاتحة. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والحمد لله الذي جعل الحمد مفتاحا لذكره وسببا للمزيد من فضله ودليلا على آلائه وعظمته، والصلاة والسلام على خاتم رسوله إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين، الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد. والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا بالقاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين، والذين اذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا. اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والسولة الحيدرية والإسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمآثر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكادمية والحجج الردبية والجود الثقفية والنقابة النكبية والحيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية. اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه. أما بعد، فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم: بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لقد كان في قصصهم إبرة لأولي الألباب. صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatima al-Zahra in particular, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Whenever there's an event of a great significance and a great magnanimity in its nature, you find that it's only natural that such an event becomes a point of contention, especially when human sentiment and emotion is involved. If you look, for example, at many of the recent wars in history, you find that there is not just one narrative about those wars. Depending on which side you're on and to whom your allegiance is, you find each group will push forward its own narrative based upon its own media. Further than that, even within one country, if the president who carried out war belonged to a particular political party, the channels of that political party will paint the action in one form and the other group will paint it in another. So it's a historical reality that whenever an event is something which is grand, an event which has significance, an event which is important, there is going to be contention about the details of that event. And the day of Ashura is no exception to this reality. when you look at the different reports about the day of Ashura, you find that there are a number of points of contention which come up year in and year out. For example, people ask the question that what was the age of the son of Imam al-Hussein Aliyun al-Akbar upon the day of Ashura? Some people will ask the question that did a wedding occur between the nephew of Imam al-Hussein Qasim towards anyone on that day of Ashura? People will ask the question that who was the first martyr upon that day? Did Ali Akbar go from the first of Ahlul Bayt or did he go from the last of Ahlul Bayt? Whenever you have an event of such historical significance, you find that a number of different people will come and write about this event, and each of them will have their own views, their own beliefs, their own methodologies, and each of them will write for their own goals. For example, when you look at those individuals who wrote about the day of Ashura, you find that they range from Shia scholars who are considered Shia scholars traditionally, all the way to the staunchest of the anti-Shia. For example, amongst those who are considered Shia scholars traditionally that wrote about the day of Ashura, you find that a scholar like Sayyid ibn Tawus writes his famous maqtal called Al-Lahuf ala Qatl al-Tufuf. You find a scholar such as Ibn Nama al-Hilli, who was the teacher of Allam al-Hilli, writes a maqtal about Sayyid al-Shuhada. You find Allam al-Majlisi in Biharul Anwar in volume 44-45 compiles hadith about the martyrdom of Sayyid al-Shuhada, and so on and so forth. But when you look at the writings about the day of Ashura, you find that they weren't just limited towards the Shia. Amongst the most famous maqatil of Imam al-Hussein, which describes the events of the day of Ashura, is the maqtal of an individual by the name of Al-Khawarizmi. Al-Khawarizmi was a Sunni scholar. And further than that, there's a maqtal by an individual by the name of Muhammad ibn Abd al-Rabbi al-Andalusi, who wrote a book called Aqtul Farid, who was actually a staunch critic of the Shia. So the point that I'm making is that when the literature about the day of Ashura is written by such a diverse group, ranging from traditional Shia scholars all the way to individuals who are anti-Shia, you find then the literature must be critically analyzed because each is bringing forth their own perspective and each is bringing forth their biases. Further than that, everyone employs a different methodology. The methodology that you employ when you're examining the events of the day of Ashura is going to have a profound impact upon the conclusions that you derive. For example, an individual like Abu Mikhnaf, who has the earliest available maqtal today, you find this individual was strictly a historian, that when he writes the events of the day of Ashura, he is not influenced by his theological belief. He is simply writing a historical account of the events of the day of Ashura. Obviously, that's going to be very different from someone like Al-Allam al-Majlisi. Allam al-Majlisi comes after hundreds of years of the development of Shia thought, and he is a narrator and a theologian, so he's going to have a different angle. And I'll give you a practical example of where the method is important to understand the event. You know, there's a discussion about the events of the day of Ashura. That was Imam al-Hussein buried by the tribe of Banu Asad? Or was Imam al-Hussein buried by Imam Zainul Abidin on the 13th of Muharram? That Imam Zainul Abidin, by means of an honor from God, returned to the land of Karbala and he buried his father. Over here, you see your method is going to impact your conclusion. If you go strictly by the historical sources and the historical method, then you'll say that Imam al-Hussein is buried by the tribe of Banu Asad. But as a believer, as someone who holds on to theology, There is a theological principle that only an imam can bury an imam, that only a ma'soom can bury a ma'soom. If through rationale you've accepted this conclusion, then the hadith and the theological perspective is going to impact your historical understanding of the day of Ashura, and you'll say that Imam Zainul Abidin buried Imam al-Hussein. Further than that, apart from belief and methodology, when people wrote about the day of Ashura, each individual had a different goal in their writing. For example, At-Tabari and Al-Biladuri and Ibn Sa'd, all of these individuals were trying to write a universal history. They wanted to write about the history of everything. And amongst the history of everything in the Muslim world was the event of Ashura. So in this goal, they wrote about the day of Ashura. But other scholars had a different goal. When Shaykh al-Mufid in Al-Irshad writes about Ashura, he wanted to write about Shia history and he includes it there. Further than that, Sayyid ibn Tawus, when he writes Al-Luhuf, his goal of writing that book is that many people, they go to ziyarah. And when you go to the ziyarah of Ahlul Bayt, you should know the masayib of Imam al-Hussein. So with that goal, he writes his book. So the point that I'm making is that when you want to understand a historical event, one fundamental subject of analysis is historiography. You see, when you use the word history in the English language, or you use the word tarikh in Arabic, Urdu, I don't know the word in Gujarati, but you find that the word history carries two meanings. Number one, history refers to the events of the past. That event is history. But number two, history refers to the way that we think, teach, and write about the past. In this sense, historiography is the study of the writing of the past. And it's a subject of the utmost importance when it comes to the day of Ashura. Because when you look at different individuals, when it comes to the musibah and the events that are recited, yes, I said that Ashura is something which is beyond history. That when we gather over here, you are not driven to learn about history necessarily, but rather it is your love of Imam al-Hussein that brings you to these majalis. But rather it is that recognition that coming to these majalis and to listen about the day of Ashura is an act of ibadah which is bringing you closer towards Allah. But at the same time, this doesn't mean we can neglect the historical reality of Ashura. There are certain people, when it comes to musibah, they say that as long as it is mentioned in a book, you are allowed to recite anything and there should be no critical analysis. It doesn't matter whether the source is early or it comes later. It doesn't matter whether the source is respecting Imam al-Hussein or disrespecting Imam al-Hussein. You find one group holds this view. Another group comes forth. They say that no, we should only use the earliest historical sources and nothing else. But a person who has studied the narrators and the sources about the day of Ashura is able to come to a critical conclusion which is in between both of these views. And that's why the subject of tonight's lecture is understanding Ashura from the angle of historiography by studying the narrators and the sources of this event. And we'll discuss this topic in the following stages. Number one, what role does history carry in the life of mankind, and how did the early Muslims view the writing of history? Number two, what three stages did the writings of the day of Ashura undergo? Number three, what are some of the earliest maqatil and sources about the day of Ashura, and how can we divide these sources? Number four, what importance does the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf carry, and who was this individual? And number five, who are those individuals that narrated the event of the day of Ashura, and what four categories can we divide this group of people into? You see, when it comes to the subject of understanding the events of the day of Ashura, we first and foremost have to understand what is the value of history. You know, when you look at all of God's creation from the angle of philosophy, it is only the human beings who are able to engage with history. Every other creation, yes, they have life and existence. They sleep, they eat, they die, they reproduce. But it is only the human being who gains another life by being embedded in history. And it is only the human being who can extract those lessons from the past and create a future that is better for him. As in, when you look at Nahjul Balagha, Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayh. Imam Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam in Nahjul Balagha says that even though I didn't live amongst the people of the past, I studied the incidents of their life to the extent that it's as if I walked with them. That Amir al-Mu'mineen had such a profound reality of history, it's as if that he was there when those events, they took place. You see, when it comes to the Muslim world, the engagement with the past is something which started even before Islam. There was a group of individuals who took special precaution to write down the events of pre-Islamic Arabia. There's a hadith in Al-Kafi that one day Rasulullah is in the mosque. And as Rasulullah is in the mosque, a person comes into the mosque and everyone begins to surround this guy. So Rasulullah says that, who is this person? They say, oh Rasulullah, this man is an allama. He's somebody who is very knowledgeable. Rasulullah says, what is his knowledge about? They say that he knows about the events of Jahiliyyah and the period of ignorance. He knows about the wars of the Arabs and he knows about poetry. Rasulullah says, this is that knowledge. If you know it, it doesn't benefit you. And if you don't know it, it doesn't harm you. In other words, that type of knowledge carried no reality for that individual. But what this tradition shows is that there was an engagement with history. And this is something which is found within the Quran as well in Surah Luqman. You know, there was an individual by the name of Nadar ibn al-Harith. Nadar ibn al-Harith was a man who traveled towards pre-Islamic Persia. And when he traveled to Persia, to Fars, he brought back the stories of Rustam and all of these ancient heroes of Persia. And when he comes back to Arabia, whenever the Quran was recited, this individual, he would tell people these stories so they would be distracted from the Quran. So at that moment, a verse is revealed. It says, وَمِنَ النَّاسِ مَن يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ لِيُضِلَّ عَنْ سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ بِغَيْرِ عِلْمٍ. That there is a group of people that they purchase these false tales to distract and deviate people from the path of God without any form of knowledge. The Quran is showing over here that to examine history just in and of itself may not necessarily contain a value. That at the end of the day, if it's something that isn't benefiting you, it may not contain that value. But at the same time, doesn't the Quran contain history? Doesn't it speak about Nabi Yusuf and the ventures of Yusuf? Doesn't it speak about the Queen of Sheba? Doesn't it speak about Yaqub, about all of these historical individuals? How do we reconcile these two facets? You see, the reason the Quran mentions these historic realities is not to say, oh mankind, just study history for no reason whatsoever. But Allah is saying that when you study history, there are lessons within that history. It's upon you to reflect over those events. That's why the Quran says, لَقَدْ كَانَ فِي قَصَصِهِمْ إِبْرَةٌ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. That within their incidents, within their stories, there is a lesson for those individuals who reflect. And based upon this Quranic emphasis about history, you find that the Muslims from the very beginning were interested in first and foremost writing down the Quran. There were scribes of the Quran. And number two, to containing and preserving the hadith of Rasulullah. That within the lifetime of Rasulullah, there were individuals who would write the Quran down, and there were scribes who would have their own personal mushaf. But we find that when it came to the writing of history in the Muslim world, there was a change which occurred after the death of Rasulullah. Because the first three caliphs and everyone after Amir al-Mu'mineen, you find that each of them banned the writing of a hadith. It was only Amir al-Mu'mineen who emphasized the value of writing, that Imam Ali, he would compile his copy of the Quran and he would write a book about blood money, which was called a Sahifa, which Bukhari refers to as well. So you find that Amir al-Mu'mineen was the only person until the middle of the 2nd century that emphasized the value of writing. And when that value was understood and writing was allowed again, you find that there were a number of books which came forth that were titled the Maqtal of Imam al-Hussein. You see, Maqtal literally in Arabic, it means the account of somebody's killing. It's recorded, Agha Buzurg Tehrani, who passed away in the 20th century, his job, he wrote a book writing about books. In other words, he looked at every book which was available and he wrote a book with the title of all of these different books. When Agha Buzurg wrote his book Ad-Dariya, he counted 58 books which had the title Maqtal al-Hussein, the killing of Imam al-Hussein. And when you look at these different works about the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein, you find that it passes through 3 stages. The first stage was the stage of narration, that before writing was allowed, you find that the incident of Karbala in the day of Ashura was passed as an oral tradition. That one person would tell another person that Hussein was killed in Karbala, and in this manner you find people would gain an awareness of the event of the day of Ashura. But after this first phase of narrating the events of the day of Ashura, the second phase through which this historical writing went through was the phase of compiling. After you have all of the narrators and you have individuals who know about the event, then you have to compile. And then stage 3 was the stage of revision and critical analysis. So number 1, there were narrators to the event. Number 2, they wrote down the event. And number 3, you find there was a critical analysis of the event. You see, when it comes to the first stage, as to who narrated the event of Karbala, there are a number of questions which require a reflection. You know, some people, they ask that if everyone died in the army of Imam al-Hussein, then who was it that was narrating these incidents? How do we know that Imam al-Hussein went into the desert and had a conversation with an individual? If we say that it's the enemies who narrated this event, isn't that problematic because they're the enemies of Ahlul Bayt? And obviously there may be some biases that we have. Then at the end of the day, who are the individuals that are narrating the events of the day of Ashura? And when you examine the group who is narrating the events of the day of Ashura, you find that they fall into 4 categories. The first category of individuals who narrated the incident of the martyrdom of Imam al-Hussein were the companions of Imam al-Hussein who were not killed in Karbala. Some may say, what do you mean? There were people who weren't killed in Karbala on the side of Imam al-Hussein? I say yes. There was one individual by the name of Hassan ibn al-Hasan al-Mutanna. Hassan ibn al-Hasan al-Mutanna is who? He is from the lineage, the son of Imam al-Hasan. You find this individual was wounded in Karbala. When he was wounded in Karbala, the tribe of his mother interceded for him and they took him to Kufa, and he ends up surviving. He ends up being one of the narrators of Karbala. Another individual who was in the army of Imam al-Hussein but survived Karbala was an individual by the name of Uqba ibn Sam'an or Aqaba ibn Saman. Uqba ibn Saman was the slave of Rabab, the wife of Imam al-Hussein, the mother of Ali Asghar. Uqba bin Saman says, I was with Hussein from Medina towards Karbala. And what had happened is that when they saw he was a slave and he was injured, they said, this individual is a slave, we'll let him go. There are many crucial narrations that come from Aqaba ibn Sam'an because he was there in the entire journey. For example, it's stated that Imam al-Hussein falls asleep. And when he falls asleep, he wakes up saying, Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. When Imam al-Hussein wakes up saying that indeed we belong to Allah and will return to Allah, his son Ali Akbar says, Oh father, what is it? Imam al-Hussein says, I saw a caravan coming to kill us. And Ali Akbar says, Awalasna alal haq, that are we not on the truth, father? This incident is narrated by Uqba ibn Saman. So you find one individual who survived Karbala was Hassan ibn al-Hasan al-Mutanna. He's a narrator. Uqba ibn Saman, the slave of Rabab, is a narrator. There was a third individual who was a very interesting individual by the name of Ad-Dahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi. Ad-Dahak ibn Abdullah al-Mashriqi, he met Imam al-Hussein on the journey to Karbala. And when he met Imam al-Hussein on the journey to Karbala, he made a deal with Imam al-Hussein. He says, O Hussein, O Yabna Rasulullah, I will accompany you to Karbala, but the moment we know that the battle is over, that your side has no chance of survival, then I will leave. On the day of Ashura, when Imam al-Hussein is alone, this Dahak al-Mashriqi comes to the Imam and he says, Oh Imam, he says, Oh Hussein, do you remember your promise to me that when the battle is about to be finished, when everyone's about to be killed, I'm allowed to leave? You know what the Imam says? The Imam doesn't beg him to say. The Imam held true to his promise. He says, Anta fi hillin min bayati. That you're absolved of this bay'ah towards me, but take your horse and leave the land of Karbala. Because if you hear my voice in the final moment and you don't help me, then I fear for your hereafter. Imam al-Hussein lets this individual go. This individual, he narrates many important events. And another individual who was from those from the army of Imam al-Hussein who didn't pass away was an individual by the name of Muwakka or Murakka ibn Tumama al-Asadi. This individual, he fought valiantly in the army of Imam al-Hussein. But what had happened is both of his arms were cut and he passed out unconscious from the bleeding. When he passed out unconscious, the army of Umar bin Saad was counting all of the heads and decapitating the members of the army of Imam al-Hussein. And as they're carrying this out, they find that this individual is alive and they let him go and exile him to Oman, and he becomes one of the narrators. So the first group of individuals who narrated the events from the day of Ashura were those who were in the army of Imam al-Hussein, but they were not martyred in Karbala. The second group of individuals who narrated the events of Karbala were those who were in the army of Umar bin Saad. Now over here, people, they may ask this question, that they are from the enemies of Ahlul Bayt, and they are narrating this event. How can we trust what they said on the day of Ashura? You see, when it comes to the study of history, there is something which is called the criterion of embarrassment. That what is this criterion of embarrassment? if somebody stands up in this hall and they say that I stole from someone, then obviously this is something which is embarrassing. You're not going to stand up and say something which is going to put you in a difficult situation. The fact that Hurmala says that I slaughtered the 6-month child of Hussein goes to show that this individual carried out this action. And there are many individuals from the army of Umar bin Saad who were critical narrators. For example, many times in Majalis, you might have heard the name of Hamid ibn Muslim or Humayd ibn Muslim. At the end of the day, who was Hamid ibn Muslim? Hamid ibn Muslim was from the army of Umar bin Saad. On the 11th of Muharram, the head of Imam al-Hussein was sent from Karbala to Kufa. The individual who carried the head of Imam al-Hussein was Hamid ibn Muslim. Hamid ibn Muslim was such an individual that when Mukhtar was having his uprising, Mukhtar said to him that I don't want you to be a part of this. Later on, he joins the Tawwabun movement, and you find that he ends up in that movement. But this individual was a critical narrator of the events of the day of Ashura. So you find the second category of people who narrated the events of the day of Ashura were from the army of Yazid and Umar bin Saad. The third group of individuals who narrated this event were the women and the children present over there. That without a doubt, Sayyida Zainab and Kulthum, they saw these events. And there are many realities which are conveyed by them. But from the fourth level, the fourth group of individuals who gave us an account of the day of Ashura were the Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. You see, many people ask the question that how do we know how many wounds were on the body of Imam al-Hussein? That was there anyone to sit there and count the wounds on the body of the Imam? The reason we know is because Imam Zainul Abidin told us. The reason we know is because Imam al-Baqir told us. The reason we know is that Imam Zainul Abidin says that the body of my father was so wounded that there was not even the spot of the stone of a ring that wasn't wounded on the body of my father. You see, there are many masaib and accounts of Ashura that come through the ziyarat literature, and in particular ziyaratun nahiya. Because when I mentioned in the beginning of the majlis that history versus hadith has a profound impact, you know, historically we can't solve who killed Imam al-Hussein. Historically, either it was Shimar, or it was Khuli, or it was Sinan ibn Anas, or it was Hussein ibn Numair. But the question is, how do we know that it's Shimar? We know because in Ziyaratun Nahiya, the Imam says, وَالشِّمَرْ جَالِسٌ عَلَى صَدْرِكَ. That Shimar was sitting upon your chest. وَمُولِغٌ سَيْفَهُ عَلَى نَهْرِكَ. And he was moving his sword to slaughter you. وَقَابِدٌ عَلَى شَيْبَتِكَ. And he was grabbing your beard as he went to slaughter you. You see, in Ziyarah, there are many accounts of the day of Ashura. And there are many lines of musibah which are not found anywhere else. For example, when you look at the historical maqatil say that Imam al-Hussein was trampled after his death. But it's only in Ziyaratun Nahiya where we find the line that Sayyid al-Shuhada was alive and his body was being trampled. Imam al-Zaman in Ziyaratun Nahiya says, Hatta nakasuka min jawadik. A point it came, Hussein, where you fell off your horse. فَحَوَيْتَ إِلَى الْأَرْضِ جَرِيحًا. And you fell to the ground wounded. تَطَاؤُقَ الْخُيُولُ بِحَوَافِرِيَا. And when you fell, the horses would trample over you, O Hussein. So you find from the fourth level the ziyarat and the words of the A'imma have a profound impact in narrating the events of Ashura. But after the first stage of narrating the event, the second stage of knowing about Ashura was the compiling of these narrations. And over here, you find that there are many early maqatil within the first 150 years of Islamic history. Yani, in other words, 90 years after Karbala, which were written. For example, the earliest maqtal we have is the maqtal of Asbagh ibn Nubata. You know who Asbagh bin Nubata is? When you hear in Masayib in Ramadan that there was a companion of Imam Ali who was crying outside of the house of Amir al-Mu'mineen, and he says, "O Master, I am crying because you are leaving me." That companion was Asbagh bin Nubata. This companion of Amir al-Mu'mineen who passes away roughly 90 after Hijrah, and Karbala is 61 after Hijrah. This individual wrote a maqtal of Imam al-Hussein. Another individual who wrote the second earliest maqtal was an individual who was a companion of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq by the name of Jabir ibn al-Yazid al-Ju'fi. After that, you have the maqtal of an individual who was a Zaydi by the name of Al-Fudail ibn al-Zubayr, who wrote a book called The Names of Those Who Were Killed with Hussein, Tasmiyatu Man Qutila Ma'al Hussein. And then after that, you find the maqtal of Ammar al-Dohni, a companion of Imam al-Baqir and al-Sadiq. And then after that, you have the maqtal of Lut ibn Yahya Abu Mikhnaf. You see, the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf is of fundamental importance. Why? Because this is the earliest surviving account of the day of Ashura we have. You see, when you divide the maqatil and the sources about Karbala, the first category is the category of those early maqtals which didn't survive. You know, this maqtal of Asbagh and Jabir bin Yazid al-Ju'fi and these companions, none of these maqatil, they survived. The second category is that category which took from category 1. In other words, when Tabari and Biladuri and these individuals were writing universal histories of the Muslim world, they took from these maqatil. You know, when an individual like Yasir Qadi gives a lecture and he says that the Shia take from Abu Mikhnaf, who is a liar, and we take from the Sunni accounts of history, it goes to show how misinformed he is about Islamic history, because Tabari takes from Abu Mikhnaf. So you find this is category 2. The third category of maqatil are those which were written for the Shia community. And they were written to compile the history of the Shia, such a work such as Kitab al-Irshad of Mufid, a work such as Al-Luhuf by Sayyid ibn Tawus, and then category 4 are the maqatil that come after the 7th and 8th century. You see, before going into this discussion, and I'm coming near the end of my time, you find the reason that the maqtal of Abu Mikhnaf carries such importance is that Abu Mikhnaf used eyewitnesses in Karbala. He passes away in the year 157, and he is from the land of Kufa. And you find this individual narrating from his tribe and his elders. Number one, there were certain individuals he narrated from that were in Karbala. Number two, there were individuals he narrated from that he heard they were in Karbala. In other words, he didn't meet them directly, but he met somebody who met them. Number three, there were individuals who weren't in Karbala, but they knew about the events in Karbala. For example, Abu Mikhnaf narrates from the wife of Zuhair ibn al-Qayn. The wife of Zuhair didn't go to Karbala, but the wife of Zuhair knew about the events, and he narrates from him. And in this manner, you find that Abu Mikhnaf, he narrates from a group of individuals who were present in Karbala or they knew about Karbala. Now you find this individual, his work has many features. The first feature of this work is that he employs a historical method without biases. You know, we don't know the identity of Abu Mikhnaf. Whether he was a Shi'i, whether he was not a Shi'i, whether he was just a political Shia, whether he was a Shia by creed, we don't really know unless you dive into the analysis. But you find this individual, because of his geographical proximity, being in Kufa, being from a tribe who's had a history of writing history, you find he was able to write this work, and this work serves a fundamental importance in the Muslim world. In summary, when it comes to the analysis of the events of the day of Ashura, you find that a person needs to be critical when analyzing this event, but at the same time, not everything is limited to historical analysis. There were individuals, when they would come in front of the imams, if you want to look at the history of majalis, there was no lecture in the early majalis. The imam would be sitting on the ground and the poet would go and he would recite a line of poetry. And when these poets would recite poetry, it wasn't only history. They would recite in a manner which was devotional to make people cry as well, so that element is there. So there is a fine balance between critical analysis, fabrication, and that devotional element when it comes to understanding the events of the day of Ashura. But upon this night, we've approached the night of the 2nd of Muharram. And when you look at all of the different works of history, it's stated that the 2nd of Muharram was that day where Sayyid al-Shuhada arrives in the land of Karbala. You know, when Imam al-Hussein, he arrives in Karbala, he speaks to the locals of that land. He says, "Masmu hadihil ard." That what is the name of this land? They say its name is Ghadiriya. The Imam says, Alaha ismun akhar, does it have another name? They say it's called Nainawa. It's as if the Imam was searching for a name to be called. He says, no, does it have another name? They say Shati'ul Furat. He says, no, Alaha ismun akhir. Then the man, he finally says, Karbun wa bala, that this is the land of trial and tribulation. You see, when Imam al-Hussein came to Karbala, Imam al-Hussein, he purchased the land of Karbala. That the Imam didn't want to be buried upon anyone else's land because he knew what a symbol his grave will become. He purchased the land from the tribe of Banu Asad. And when he purchases that land, after speaking to the men of Banu Asad, he says, now go and call your women. When the women of Banu Asad come, the Imam says to them that if the men of your tribe don't bury us, then as you're getting water from the Furat, bury us. Then Sayyid al-Shuhada looks towards the children of Banu Asad and he says, if your elders don't bury us, then you, as you're playing upon this land, put sand upon our body. You see, after Sayyid al-Shuhada was martyred, the day of the 13th of Muharram it came. When the day of the 13th of Muharram came, Banu Asad comes out to the land of Karbala. When Banu Asad comes to the land of Karbala, they notice that these bodies are scattered throughout the land of Karbala and there isn't a head upon any of these bodies. At that moment, they're thinking that how do we bury these bodies? As they're looking at the bodies, a man from the direction of Kufa, that man, he comes towards Karbala. And when he comes to Karbala, he says, O tribe of Banu Asad, I will tell you how to bury these bodies. He says, go and dig one grave for the companions. They dig a grave for the companions. You know, as they're digging that grave, one man comes to that individual. He says, oh man, there is a body by the Furat. When we pick one side of the body, the other half it breaks apart. And when we pick the other side of the body, the other half it breaks apart. The Imam says, that is the body of my uncle Abbas. I will bury that body. That Imam Zainul Abidin, he buries the body of his uncle. Then after that, Imam Zainul Abidin says, oh Banu Asad, step back at this moment. It's stated he places a cloth upon the ground. Why does he place a cloth? He begins to gather the pieces of the body of his father. He begins to bury his father. You know, as the Imam is burying his father, they bring the body of a young man towards Imam Zainul Abidin. You know whose body that was? That was the body of his brother Ali Akbar. The Imam says his father loved Ali Akbar. Bury Akbar by the feet of his father. But you know, it's stated in the Maqatil, as the body of Imam al-Hussein is being placed in the ground, a voice comes from the cut head, from the cut body of Imam al-Hussein. You know what that voice it said? It said, Tifli, Tifli, my child. At that point, Imam Zainul Abidin says, oh Banu Asad, where is the body of the 6-month infant? Imam Zainul Abidin, he places Ali Asghar on the chest of Imam al-Hussein. He writes on the grave, Hada qabru Abi Abdullah, alladhi qutila gharib hadshana. Ala la'natullah ala al-qawm al-zalimeen. Ya Allah, through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, wherever the followers of Ahlul Bayt are in difficulty, help them. Wherever they're sick and ailing, cure them. There are many in this hall who have sorrow, who have difficulties, who have anxiety, who have different challenges that they're going through. Through the right of the one who buried his father in Karbala, help them. And Ya Allah, we pray for the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, Matam Hussein.
Ya Hussein, Karbala, Karbala, Karbala hai, Karbala, 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 Karbala hai. जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले चल मुझे रोज़ाए शबीर पर दूंगा दुआले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के करबला ले है जहाँ गंजे शहीदा है जहाँ नहरे फुरात जिस जगह सैयद मेरा प्यासा रहा ले चल मुझे जाने वाले करबला के जिस जगह जागी थी किस्मत हुर की वो देखूंगा मैं आसियो पर कैसे होती है अताले चल मुझे जाने वाले جس جگہ عباس کے بازو قلم ہو کر گرے اس جگہ میں بھی کروں ماتم ذرا لے چل مجھے جان والے کربلا کے کربلا لے چل مجھے یا حسین یا حسین